I wanted to say something about actually about the dynamics underlying when we include the unconscious. What are the dynamics that underlie what we're witnessing now being said more and more, and that is that we are more or less virtually at the edge of a new war in the world. And just to set it up, what I wanted to say, actually, what I wanted to bring forward is that um, science, classical science, operates actually under uh, the assumption that the observer is a reliable source of information, and basically the whole of science, which is the way we reach information, rests on that. But what we find in, for instance, in what I have been doing my whole life in psychotherapy, is that the observer is not reliable, and that if the observer is included in the equation, that you get a whole different understanding of reality and observation. And so I wanted to speak to that, because if we were to track the process by including the observer, and thus track the process by including the observer, and thus, so for instance, you would get that someone would come in and say that his biggest problem is his wife, because the wife would be over controlling or whatever, and he would basically want a solution for the wife, and he not seeing that it is his behavior that is evoking that behavior in the wife. You see, and that really gets at the issue, the problem. So you would be, in terms of war, if you wish, or conflicts, you would be creating the very enemy that you think you have to do away with. You see, and that's how complicated this is. If you really look at the problem in a, what I would then call, by lack of, because it's a symbolical way of describing it, when you look at this problem in a way including the observation problem, then you get that, for instance, with terrorism, then you get that that the very projection of terrorism out there, the very, what we would then call observation, which is actually projection, would be tacitly creating the very problem. You see? And then the whole idea of science, that you can somehow find facts to prove theories independent of the observer, still becomes that people would set out to find facts to prove their beliefs, which are their projections. So there's nothing as, actually the whole idea of observation would be then obsolete. At most, what we can find is that we can figure out how are we creating our reality, but you cannot observe reality independent of yourself.
So, to go back to the husband and the wife, he comes in and he says, "Can you help me with my wife?" So what would be the projection he has on her, that he can't fix himself?
Exactly.
Well, he doesn't know he's projecting because she's the problem. So what could he be projecting on her that he actually can take back and take ownership of his problem?
Right. You see, the projection would be then that he would be projecting this over controlling, dominating mother on the wife, under the delusion that would be an observation, an objective observation, and he would have to realize that it's not. The projection would be then, as it were, the opposite of his behavior, it would mean that he would be behaving like a little child, a 4-year-old, and that would be creating the projection, the experience of the mother being, the wife being like this over controlling mother. And that experience would then, as it were, seduce the wife into behaving like that. So you would get a kind of a mimicking of the surrounding with a fitting of the surrounding, the screen with the projections. But this man would experience it as something befalling him, independent of him. You see, and if that's the whole thing, if you were to superimpose that on international relations between two nations or between two groups of nations, then you would get that basically we would be creating the very enemy that we think we need to get rid of. And you would get that, you would see that dynamic, for instance, in nations that are where a dictator is toppled or dies, and you would get in a very short period the very same leader to replace that dictator, because the people are so heavily invested in creating that type of leader for themselves, while they think they're fighting it and that it's like their greatest enemy. So people are creating the leaders that they have unconsciously, you see, and that's the thing. And then we set out to engineer evidence to confirm our beliefs. For instance, if our projection is the terrorist, which I believe is what I call an externalized panic attack, and you don't want to, as a nation, you don't want to come to terms with the fact that you are having a panic attack. You prefer the projection that somebody out there is trying to terrorize you. It's like saying I prefer to feel that you think I'm foolish, instead of having to come to grips with the fact that I feel foolish.
So you could compare that to a street phobia. Somebody that doesn't want to leave his house.
Exactly.
Because something bad will happen if you go outside.
Exactly. And then the cause is projected on the surrounding. You see, and then what happens is that somebody is going to then unconsciously seek evidence to create that terrorist out there.
Yeah.
To make that case that there is terrorists that are trying to terrorize me, or this man would set out to find evidence to prove that his wife is this over controlling mother, and not see that he is fearful, he is not mature, acting like an adult and making his own decisions and behaving like an adult, and this is so then you see this reading interpretation of the situation is much more realistic, because you would get then that people would I think people have great difficulty believing that, for instance, a government would inflict great destruction upon its own people. This reading would make it much more understandable, and that is that the projection, the undealt with panic attack will be externalized, and then we will unconsciously, as it were, need to find evidence for the fact that it is out there that is causing the terror. And then you would get then a tacit collaboration with the creation of this enemy, which would inflict harm upon us. You see, and that in this way it becomes much more understandable, because people would have great difficulty, for instance, believing that that you would have someone that would set out cold-bloodedly to inflict damage upon him or his own nation or his own family or his own self. So yes, this is an unconscious process, and we are. You see, most it's Carl Gustav Jung, that actually came to grips with this to teach us to understand that how this really works. In Jung's terms, observation is projection. So what you are seeing out there is a projection. And what you have is a choice to change your projections, to see something different. But the seeing is the first stages of a creation. If I see my wife as being this over-controlling mother because I am stuck in the role of this immature child, my behavior will eventually generate that, because if not, I would be confronted with the fact that what I'm believing is completely ridiculous. So people are very invested in generating evidence or proving or creating thus their projections
to be true.
Yes.
And facts, that they're really facts.
Yes. So we would go. So a lot of facts, so-called glimpses that have emerged. For instance, where you would see, for instance, that the West has armed Saddam Hussein, to then a little while later go on to assassinate him. People, a lot of in any normal way of think, people would go like, that's like totally contradictory, but within this model you would get that somebody would be unconsciously generating the facts and the enemy that is needed to fit the projections unconsciously. And then, for instance, another glitch in the thought process would be like, why would the West be selling arms to the nations that they are considering terroristic? You see? There's no logic for that. But there's a logic. So if you were to put a microscope on this man and you would observe his behavior at home.
Who was the man?
With his wife, the over controlling mother-ish wife. If you were to, like, one of the exercises that I give is that I say, okay, you need to go home now and you need to observe yourself in terms of the new frame.